Welcome to the Dank Christian Memes podcast. Dank Christian Memes is a community on reddit.com where all kinds of Christians and all kinds of non-Christians share memes and fellowship. Our podcast covers topics related to faith, culture, current events, and Reddit. Thank you for listening.
Hey, Jacob.
Yeah.
So we're on a bit, I would call this an epistemological kick that we've been focused on epistemology lately. What's the best way to do it? Epistemology is the philosophy of how we know things, right? Is that how you would put it?
How we know what we know.
Which often tells us a little bit about our values too, what we value knowing,
right.
What we think is worth, sort of holding aloft as more important.
And how you
stuff.
think knowledge is derived and what instantly disproves something else, etc.
Yeah, and I think feedback so far has been pretty positive because I think this is where the rubber hits the road for a lot of people, that for them, when you put religion in one corner and you put, science and sort of enlightenment style thinking in the other corner, then everything's okay. But if they get near each other, then we have problems. So we talked a little bit with Andrew about sort of these, I feel a little bad calling them Catholic flashpoints because that was all there was back then. But, it is sort of a part of the history of the Catholic Church. We talked a little bit about Galileo, that being more about politics and politeness than actual science and theology in a lot of cases. But the Snopes monkey trial, which shocking no one. Scopes. Thank you.
Snopes is the fact-checking website. Scopes is
the
guy who was trying.
Well, and you can see where my brain has made that correlation there.
Yeah.
But this is a really uniquely Protestant, uniquely American kind of event, isn't it?
Yes, and I would argue, as we'll get into here, that its importance to both the debate as well as to American politics is sort of widely misunderstood. Like you mentioned with the Galileo affair, this is the story not really of a normal court case, but of one that was set up by conditions outside of the religious debate. And so we're going to get into that a little bit.
We've seen that before and after with the Supreme Court, that sometimes the cases that come between, I don't want to say that they're contrivances, but they're not necessarily based on an actual case, which I think is surprising to a lot of people. I remember being taught there has to be an actual event, there has to be an actual case. It seems like that isn't always the way it works out.
The Scopes trial was 100% a contrived case. We're going to talk about that.
But do you feel like it was inspired by anything that came before? Like, was it standing on the shoulders of anything, or had it taken anything as a stepping stone to make people say, hey, this is a thing we might be able to do?
It's weirder. So I guess we'll just jump into it. So to discuss the Scopes trial, we first have to go back to the sort of conditions that set it up. There was a moral panic in the early 1900s in America that had to do with the role that Christianity had with modern society. There was a split that we now call the fundamentalist modernist controversy. It was called that then as well, but the exact meanings of those terms were different. Basically, American Protestants we're in division over whether they should stick to a firm literal reading of the Bible, or if they should they could interpret it through the lens of modernism, through science, and through other new ways of thinking.
You mentioned before that even when you interpret something literally, that is still an interpretation.
Right. And I
think that's something folks try to sidestep.
It should be stressed that the fundamentalist line here was also part of it also had a lot to do with certain people and like racial politics. Progressives were in on it too in some ways, but and in this trial our major figure Brian is not going to be affiliated with the KKK or anything, but historically this controversy had a racial component. A lot of fundamentalists saw racial integration as possibly threatening their good Christian society. Thankfully, this case and story largely avoids that discussion, but it needs to be pointed out for the purposes of historical context.
And I think I'm going to add that one to our list of potential topics. And I think it would be great to get a professor for it, because I've seen a lot of comments on Dank Christian memes, and I think everyone means well. But a lot of folks really don't understand what, sort of segregation in Protestant churches and sort of North and South divides, what those mean historically compared to, how they represent today. But that's a conversation. That's an episode for another time. But what year did this trial start? Was this something that people were like today when we hear about Supreme Court stuff, we hear they're taking up the case, we hear they're debating the case, we expect, a verdict, but it's really once the verdict comes out that people care and there's an uproar and maybe people start making political commercials or what have you. But I get the impression that this was really more about the case. It was more about the trial and the process, maybe more than the verdict. What are your thoughts on that?
This was the verdict. We'll get to that. The verdict is underwhelming. This happened in 1925, essentially just months before the trial had happened. Tennessee had passed the Butler Act, named after John Washington Butler, who was basically a major advocate in U.S. politics at the time at limiting the teaching of evolution in schools. He saw it as a moral threat. The majority of the scientific establishment was firmly on the side of evolution at this point. This is like 3/4.
It's already firmly an issue, and people have already, there's a line in the sand, and many people are already on their chosen side.
Yeah, and most Christians, according to historians writing about the period at the time in the United States, were still anti-evolution, at least in what they professed. Now, there's an interesting situation here, which is that even though the Butler Act prohibited the teaching of specifically human evolution, so the idea that humans evolved from other primates, the textbooks that were actually required by the state of Tennessee had not been updated in those several months between the Butler Act and the trial. So teachers were actually teaching out of textbooks that were written according to current scientific knowledge and actually used evolution as their basic assumption. And so that's an interesting thing here is a lot of the discussion before the trial was about how teachers were both prohibited from teaching about this topic and offered materials by the state specifically to do it, and sort of required to use them. So this situation was bound to happen, but the way it ended up happening is bizarre. Basically, the town of Dayton in Tennessee was a very small town, considered a very pleasant town at the time. Apparently, it was one of the few places in Tennessee that wasn't overrun by the KKK and whatnot at the time.
What a time that you got to watch out for that. What's the KKK rating of this neighborhood, and do I want to live here? Really speaks to the historical moment that this is taking place in.
But basically, the town authorities, the local authorities, as well as George Raplia, who is sort of the engineer behind this. He was a literal engineer. He was the owner of, or rather the local manager of Cumberland Coal and Iron Company. So this is a sort of mining town in the Appalachians. and they want publicity to the town to sort of boost the local economy. And so they have a meeting, and they basically hatch a plot. The plot was to use the new law to purposefully create a violation situation so that they could bring in national attention to the town and boost its reputation. The entire situation.
So it was a tourism, like they thought this would increase tourism by having like a huge legal battle.
Yes, tourism, local economic interest.
That seems like a real non sequitur to me, but maybe things were just different back then.
The Scopes trial was entirely created by a plot to bring attention to its small town.
So this isn't a conspiracy theory, though, that like we actually have evidence that like
this isn't a conspiracy theory
because we do have an episode on conspiracy theories coming up. So I want to make sure we don't back ourselves into a corner too early here.
John Scopes, who was accused of teaching evolution, said after the trial that he had no memory of if he had or not. He wasn't even sure if he ever had taught evolution in schools. He was a substitute teacher for the local science teacher who volunteered to be basically the guinea pig for this plot. He asked the very students he taught to testify against him so that he would have basically an accusation against him for this. Scopes was a 100% willing victim in this.
Wow, what a unique. And this, the idea that a substitute teacher would try to teach much of anything rather than just survive the time they have to with the class is interesting enough. But this feels like quite a setup. Did it get TV coverage? Was that something that happened at the time? Was this mostly a newspaper affair?
Newspaper, Telegraph. Actually, we'll get to that. But this was a major media moment for like U.S. media history and coverage of things. But essentially, the Scopes did have a strong opinion on this, as many other people did, as many science teachers did. They basically saw that this was an academic liberties case, and so he was willing to take it up on that principle alone. The idea was that the Butler Act essentially required teachers who were there to teach science to go against scientific consensus, as well as violated their freedoms to teach scientific ideas. So for people in education and in science in general, this was an issue that mattered a lot to them. It was the newspaper coverage that was invited to do this that basically made it a major press issue. Part of the plot was also to invite very high-profile people. George Raplia actually wrote to H.G. Wells to join the defense team. And H.G. Wells was like, "What? I'm not a lawyer."
Wasn't he like an actor, writer, or something? Like
novelist. He wrote War of the Worlds.
Okay.
Time Machine. And he.
So they were just trying to get as much star power in their witnesses, was it?
Yeah, basically. And H.G. Wells was like, "What?" And he refused to go. But the fact that he reached out and like responded is just a very fun piece of historical trivia.
Makes me think that it was a wide net. That there were a lot of people received letters. What percentage, threw those letters out versus replied, we may never know.
Right. So two notable figures popped up, one for each side, that we should discuss because they're going to be the main characters here, really. John Scopes says a single line of testimony in the entire trial. The two major figures for this week-long trial that come up are William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. William Jennings Bryan is probably the most famous figure involved here. He was a 3-time presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. He had lost all three of those, which is why you don't see him on president's lists. He was a major engine of progressive politics in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and this was sort of after his major retirement. But because he had a reputation as basically the greatest speech giver in American politics, you can listen to his Cross of Gold speech if you want to see an example of that, in which he argues during the election campaign for the election of 1900, basically for bimetallism, the idea that the U.S. should back its currency with both gold and silver. This was like his major thing. McKinley
I just want to point out the year that the case was decided. I've gone to the wiki now. Was July 21st, 1925. Which, if memory, I asked if this was a television affair. I think TVs existed, but like no one had them, or something like that.
Like TV wasn't widely distributed, but it was around. People were definitely in movie theaters and stuff. You can see
1925. I think I had thought that it happened later. I think I had imagined it happened in the 40s, but yeah, square in the middle of the 1920s.
Yeah, no, this is solidly in the interwar period. But yeah, Bryan is one of the most famous political figures in the United States. He's been out of politics for a while, but he comes back for this because Bryan was a devout Baptist. We associate him with progressive politics, but it's important to remember that this is before religion in the United States was a clearly political split. The sort of religious fundamentalism may have had an element of religious reactionary politics, but it was also associated with progressive politics at the same time. So Bryan represented the progressive side of basically the fundamentalist movement. He actually, on a side note here that I think is fun, he sort of popularized grape juice in the United States because he didn't drink wine, and so at his campaign events, he used the sort of newly invented non-alcoholic grape juice as his go-to beverage. And so because of that, grape juice is like widely commercially available now and popular. He may have also had a significant role in making that a communion staple.
Now, you said he was Baptist, because I recall.
Oh, Presbyterian. Sorry, he was Presbyterian.
Well, I've heard Methodists claim, credit for the grape juice. So I wonder if we have multiple denominations trying to claim credit for the grape juice.
I think it's all at the same time. I said Baptist. He's Presbyterian. Sorry. He didn't drink wine though. That was the thing. The other side has to do with an organization that actually still exists today, but had basically just been founded at the time, which is the American Civil Liberties Union. Clarence Darrow, who is the head of the union and an agnostic and a firm critic of the relationship between church and state. He originally wanted to decline because he thought that this case would be like nonsense and didn't want to be there. But
I see why he might come to that conclusion.
Right. As he saw like major figures showing up, he said, it's going to be whether I'm there or not. They should have my involvement, I guess. And he also saw that it was ramping up with major figures like Bryan, who were fundamentalists, and he thought that was a threat to the well-being of the country if this went the wrong way. Because as the situation escalated, people within the media, the general understanding that came to develop was that this would be a case that sort of would either legitimize or tear down the prohibition on the teaching of evolution. And I use the term prohibition here very purposefully because throughout this debate, there was actually comparisons here to the prohibition movement and the drinking of alcohol, because that was also pushed by the fundamentalist movement. And
was going to say I had thought that teetotaling or choosing not to drink as part of a religious or Christian experience was popular during this time. And that seems very consistent with the alcohol prohibition. This all kind of reminds me, like, we hear people talk today about degeneracy.
Mhm.
And I feel like it's a very similar vibe that, drinking a lot is degeneracy. Believing or teaching certain things is degeneracy. It seems like a earlier version of a sort of narrative we see thrown around the internet a bit, especially in certain corners.
Yeah, it definitely had the same. The idea was here among fundamentalists that the major danger of teaching evolution was a moral one. If humans were no different from other animals, they argued, morality would go out the window. Humans wouldn't be treated any differently than other animals, etc. And so this,
these may be folks who remembered actual slavery that actually was those things that they were afraid of. Like,
right. No, this is still,
we fear the things and the systems that we perpetuate turning against us.
This is still the South at this time also. The racial situation is not great either, but they're not really thinking about that. It's a separate issue from this one. Even progressives can be brought on the same side as the racists if they're both the fundamentalists in this debate.
Yeah, I feel like, and maybe we'll talk more about this towards the end, that, we see people today very entrenched in their opinions. And I feel like events like these contribute to that entrenchment, but we'll see. I shouldn't get ahead of myself here.
Yeah. So interestingly, we brought up media. This is actually the first trial to be broadcast on U.S. national radio. The media, when they discovered this trial and when these massive figures started showing up, got very interested. This trial had thousands of miles of telegraph wires laid for it as journalists began showing up. Massive amounts of journalists poured into this town. There was a tourist response. It was at the time the most widely reported American event to that date in Britain. British interest skyrocketed.
How long did the trial last, you said?
The trial lasted, it was 8 days, I believe.
So it was just an 8-day media frenzy, or was there a lot of lead up to this too? It was an
11-day legal case. Sorry, 11 days.
Okay.
It was, the media frenzy. It was April that the plot had been hatched, and then it was July that it sort of took place. So there was about 3 months.
Pretty quick turnaround.
There was about 3 months of purposeful stoking of flames.
Right.
And it was very effective and very successful at creating national news. So you can think of this as, people today do publicity stunts for different things.
Sort of a prototype of things we might see today, especially around, important legal trials, which there's been many in the news in recent days and in recent years. There's a lot of important legal decisions being made.
This was very much the formative case that made for a performative American legal nationally covered case, right? We talk about things like the Rittenhouse trial and how people have looked at them from all over the country. That is very much in the shadow of Scopes. This idea.
So what actually was at the heart of the matter? And I'm trying not to lay it all at your feet. I am looking at the Wikipedia page here, but what was the actual subject of the case? And did it seem like the judge was focused on that subject, or was the judge along for the ride that was clearly being built around this issue.
So the judge was, as commentators at the time observed, clearly biased. The judge was very sympathetic to the fundamentalists in general, but he urged also the trial itself to focus on the specifics of the case and not the sort of buzz around it. This failed spectacularly. Most of the discussion was fairly religious in nature or scientific in nature. As the trial began, the two sides basically took their strategies. Brian, in particular, would attempt to argue, especially because, Brian understood that this trial was basically in a bag. The end of the trial would be that Scopes was guilty because Scopes had set himself up to be guilty. He had already basically confessed.
Well, so he was a substitute teacher, but he was sort of set up to look as though he was this martyr who was going to teach what he was going to teach because that was the right thing to do. And that may be beside the fact, but that's sort of what was sold in the media. Am I keeping up here?
And that is what Scopes would later argue as well, even though he wasn't sure if he had actually taught it. But no, he was very much on the side of teachers should be able to do this, and I would violate it anyway. Brian knew this, and he knew that a judge looking at this from a legal perspective would be pretty on board, right? With Brian's argument, because the case was clear. So because of that, Brian was able to focus instead on using the national media attention to argue for the case of fundamentalism. And he spent much of his time doing that. Brian's whole stance was that he would answer any atheist, agnostic, secularist, etc. On his Christian faith and defend it in front of them.
Was he just kind of standing and delivering on his theology against all questioners, which sounds more like a street preaching event than a legal proceeding?
His words very much read like a street preaching event. Darrow, on the other hand, was very harsh. Darrow basically went about it with the idea that this was this whole situation was a violation of American and Tennessee state secularism, and therefore letting figures like Brian dominate the political discussion about this issue was letting a certain unreasonable, mad political dynamic get a hold in the country. Darrow's words are pretty stark at one point. He basically wrote, to use two quotes from them. Brian said that the whole court session had become to cast ridicule on everybody who believes the Bible. And Darrow responded, quote, "We have the purpose of preventing bigots and ignoramuses from controlling the education of the United States." So it was not very kindly between the two.
So this sounds, this really does sound like an early dividing line. And whether or not it's in earnest, it feels like our Christianity versus our atheism. It feels like those talking points in their infancy that, I don't hang out at them, but we're pretty confident that, you'll see that in comments. The trolls of either side will sort of reenact this sort of, my theology can fight on all comers, or I can take on all theologies, depending on which side you find yourself on.
Yeah. And to be fair to Darrow, he was an agnostic. He did identify as an agnostic. He didn't consider religion categorically wrong so much as this specific movement was a threat to American rational society.
So he didn't hate theology or God. He found this particular theology to be a threat. And I think a lot of people agreed with him and probably would still agree with him.
Yeah. And so let's talk about the general like proceedings and discussions. The judge was apparently willing enough to quote Genesis, which was indicated from the beginning about how the leanings at the court would go.
All right, I just want to point, and let me know if you agree with this or not, but
Okay.
We're in 1925 in the American South.
Yeah.
Before MLK, before the civil rights movement, that in order to get anywhere in a lot of these communities, and it's true today in North and South, but I think it was especially true then, that you had to be connected with a religious community in order to progress socially. So I would be surprised if any judge in the state of Tennessee or elsewhere didn't have some kind of church affiliation.
Mm-hmm.
That the idea of being unbiased seems almost impossible in this cultural setting where Christianity, whatever flavor you might subscribe to, seems to be very, very central for a lot of folks. So it's hard to imagine a court proceeding that doesn't reflect that bias.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that sums it up pretty well. So the trial went on for a few days, relatively uninterestingly, for the first part, I think. But basically, Brian was railing against evolution and wanted to bring on a number of written, or rather, Darrow wanted to bring on a number of written statements from experts. And the judge was basically like, "This is irrelevant. We're discussing a court case about a specific instance and not whether evolution is true or not. So your experts on evolution are a little bit irrelevant here." And so because of that, it very much boils down to two men having a duel. Because neither of them were Bible experts or evolution experts. They were presenting very much the sort of popular manifestation of this debate. That said, Brian, as a very devout fundamentalist, was very familiar with the Bible and his reading of it, and was able to punch around quite a bit. And so basically the defense decided that they should call Brian as a witness on the Bible, because and Darrow even called him a Bible expert, which surprised everyone and made everything all the spicier. So basically, Brian was brought up to the stage to be asked questions about his biblical faith, and to defend what his side saw as basically the future of Christianity. And what the defense saw as fundamentalist nonsense. And so basically, Brian
to see what his religious or theological education is, but maybe that's not really the measure they were using when they said he was a Bible expert.
Yeah. Brian basically reacted to this initially by suggesting that this was a way for Darrow to attack the Bible by using him as a proxy, but he still decided, I'm going to do this because of his principle of that he could defend himself against secularists. And so they began talking about the book of Genesis. The initial questioning centered around Adam and Eve, and the idea of a talking snake. Darrow was like, how can you believe this? Seriously. and Brian said he believed things as they were written there. And he kept, whenever Darrow would paraphrase something, he would insist that Darrow should represent his beliefs properly by quoting it directly out of the Bible. Which
he's very much hiding behind the Bible and trying to like hurl Bible verses as pot shots. And then anytime he tries to clarify his theology, he just says, well, it says what it says, basically.
Yeah. One of the things was whether Eve was created from Adam's rib. The big one was, or one of the fun ones was where Cain got his wife. Because if you're familiar with the book of Genesis, Cain seems to take a wife from somewhere, and it's implied that there are other people's places, but also he's one generation after Adam and Eve. So this question has raised eyebrows for a while. And Brian basically said, what was it he said? It was he would leave the agnostics to hunt for her. So he was uninterested in this question, and the agnostics can go keep looking if they want.
I would have said, well, we saw that Adam and Eve could be created whole cloth, so obviously God could create anyone else whole cloth, and it's not even worth talking about anymore because we know it happens.
Yeah, Darrow says here his probably most starkly anti-Christian line, which is, you insult every man of science and learning in the world because he does not believe in your fool religion. They kept going on. Another one was how many people.
I would still take that to be against his particular theology and not all theologies, but maybe I'm just a little.
It could be, but I think this shows that even though Darrow was in practice going after something specific, he also had other ideas.
I'm sure there are many people who did feel attacked by proxy when he would say these things and did feel that Christianity itself was being attacked. So, I'm sure that was pretty spicy stuff.
Right. Another thing was that the discussion, I find this one fun, how many people lived in ancient Egypt. Because the idea was if Noah and his family got off the ark not that long before, how could they breed up to like the populations that built ancient Egyptian civilization?
These are good ones. I feel like these questions should be asked more often, just in their own context.
Yeah, and then there was Joshua and the making the sun stand still, and the idea was should we take that allegorical in the Copernican model or whatever? Like the Earth stopped spinning, a bunch of things. Brian mostly just like affirmed these things. He was just he didn't. He gave strong words, but it would be. I feel like he didn't give arguments that were that.
Well, it seems like he was on a tightrope walk where if he said anything, like if he stayed center ground on the scripture itself, then he would have a high level of vicariety with all Christian groups who are paying attention. But if he veered in any particular direction, then he would gain favor with some at the expense of others. It seems like a man who's very aware of the line he has to walk to have maximum success in what I'm going to say was kind of a matter of theatrics. Like, dude, how much of this was theatrics? How much of this was about the process, and how much of it is actually a decision that actually made an impact on people? And I forgive my ignorance for that. I know about the drama of the trial, but I don't know about its impact. I don't hear about that as much.
Yeah. So I would say, well, to skip ahead a little bit, the actual deliberation by the jury at the end took 9 minutes. The case was so clear on the actual talking points. The case was so clear on the actual talking point that
I can't get my McDonald's food in 9 minutes. That's crazy.
Yeah, no. After more than a week of discussion that was largely irrelevant to the actual case at hand, the deliberation was incredibly quick. After all, Scopes had already stated that he was guilty. He spoke for the only time at the end of the trial. He said, "Your Honor, I feel that I have been convicted of violating an unjust statute. I will continue in the future, as I have in the past, to oppose this law in any way I can. Any other action will be in violation of my ideal of academic freedom. That is, to teach the truth is guaranteed in our Constitution of personal and religious freedom. I think the fine is unjust." But I should, before we talk about the after effects here, I should talk about how big of a sensation this was again, because essentially over the course of the time it had been developing, a sort of public festival had emerged outside. The courthouse was so packed and so hot in the hot weather that the latter part of the trial was entirely held outside. If you see photographs of the Scopes trial, it was not held in the courthouse. It was held in like chairs set up on the lawn, because everyone was uncomfortable inside. This meant that it was great for just media to surround, reporters to surround, telegraph wires to be relayed to click words live to everywhere, all over the United States and to the UK. An airstrip was set up to like fly people in and out. Two chimpanzees, training chimpanzees were brought in and performed tricks on the lawn because everyone was talking about apes. And so, yeah, like basically a festival had emerged. And this was,
I'm sorry, when you said festival, I thought like it was a media festival, right? Like, yeah. But that like they actually brought monkeys. So that's 5 stars. I would recommend. What do you think about the trial, Mike? I'm sorry, what trial? This is just a lot of fun.
Yeah. So no, this was an unprecedented event in American media history. Like really, this was the grand event of its day. Everyone was talking about this. Everyone was showing up to see what was going on, and because there had been such buzz, it was sort of generating by itself an atmosphere of excitement for people with one opinion one way or the other to show up and really mingle and talk about things, and also just have fun, because plenty of people did not take this seriously at all and just took it as fun drama. But yeah, at the end of the trial, Ralston, the judge, ordered Scopes to pay a $100 fine, which really was not that much. That's $1,700 today. It was very, very low for how much had just happened. The myth that sort of comes out of the Scopes trial is that it was the death of fundamentalism in the school system. It was really not that at all. If anything, it was a catalyst for its growth.
And that's something I wanted to say, and we've touched on this a few places, but we've seen, and I'm not just making stuff up here. There's people who've done reports and written some books on this, that schools, especially public boards of education, have started to become very, very political. And when we look at this event, and when we look at the sort of debates that have come up in school board meetings, like it's very easy to see a sort of historical connection about 100 years out. Mm-hmm. And it feels like to me that this trial, and I'm looking like, I don't know, was there any jurisprudence on this? Did it have any standing on any, like I'm looking at the end of the trial and I'm not seeing that there was any actual significance other than the event.
No, the legal,
I guess there was an appeal.
No. Yes. So what happened is there was an appeal because the understanding of the defense was that this law was basically unconstitutional in the first place under both the U.S. and state constitutions. The argument under the U.S. Constitution was it violated the Establishment Clause, which the jurists largely shot back at by saying prohibiting the teaching of evolution is not actually a specific religious establishment. Rather, it is just a specific scientific teaching direction. And so that one basically dissolved. The other was under the Tennessee Constitution, where there was a clause about basically the legislature respecting literature and science. And this was so vague that interpreting it could basically go any direction, and nothing really came of that. However, the result of the trial was overturned. And it was overturned on a technicality to do with the Butler Act, which is the Butler Act specified a minimum fine of $100, and Tennessee judges without the jury could not order fines above $50. The jury had not ordered the fine. The judge had done so unilaterally, which meant that
which is completely beside anything that was argued in the case. Like, right. Sure, but that has no bearing on the facts or lack thereof that were argued.
Basically, the judge had no legal right to unilaterally place a fine on the under the Butler Act, which is hilarious to me. So like the courts basically found the statute unconstitutional, and this Scopes never had to pay after all of this.
Did he not have to pay, or did because no? I guess if there was an appeal, then he probably may not have been required to pay.
Yeah.
But that's got to be the story of the most / least dedicated substitute teacher ever. Maybe we'll talk about this more when we talk about schools and conspiracy theories and stuff like that. But this does feel so. When I was introduced to this, I had a couple of science teachers that knew they were going to bump up against this issue. Mm-hmm. And I think what they did, and I think they even told us they were doing it, was teaching the controversy. And I don't think it's because they were afraid of any legal issues, because as we found, there doesn't seem to be any real legal teeth into this case, especially if you don't live in Tennessee, which I did not. That the teachers were more concerned about the parents, that if anyone's parents were of a particular political or theological position or political position, right, that as a science teacher you might bump up against something and make someone upset. So by teaching the controversy, like, I'm not going to tell you which is right, I'll just tell you what each side said. But I feel like there's a level of delicacy that teachers have, not because of this court case necessarily, but because of the cultural awareness, and that no one wants to be part of a court case, right? That if this substitute teacher person could get to the top of such a media frenzy, that you wouldn't want that if you were really just trying to get through your curriculum and have most of your students pass science class.
Right. Yeah, I think this is, like I said, it's more important for defining the way the debate goes on than is about any American legal history. What was sort of learned here by both creationists and advocates of evolutionary teaching in schools was that a spectacle could be created through public debate. Creationists might be losing within science, but they were standing very well in public discourse, especially when, like Brian, who, by the way, died like a week after the end of this case, which is hotly debated how related those are to each other. He may have
Wow,
gotten
he
too
put
hot out there.
everything he had into it, and then
Yeah, no. Some
then
people
just
think he got
after.
some people think that in the like heat he got like too hot, and it might have been bad for his health as a very old man. Others say that it's probably just a coincidence. Whatever the case, his sort of disappearance from fundamentalism meant they lost their big star at the time, and for a while did not really have that sort of public direction in the same way. But yeah, this made the debate very public in general and caused people to set sides in public
And I think
discourse.
there's something that this and the arguments about segregating and desegregating schools have in common is the think of the children factor, right? That whatever we think about these issues is one thing, but wait, they're teaching the children something I don't agree with. And I think that that's been more or less what a lot of these controversies around schools boil down to today is someone's teaching something I don't like. Therefore, I want to try to get in the way of it or make sure it's okay to teach what I want to teach. That there is definitely an understanding that this is a political fight that almost anyone can fight in. That you if you live in a town, you can run for the Board of Education and you don't need to have a child in the school system or anything. And in some ways that's cool, right? People are really like, wow, I kind of can just walk into my local politics and get engaged. But some folks are not doing so with a very positive attitude, regardless of what their position might be. That we've also seen an uptick in what would you call it? Volatility in these meeting places.
The trial also sort of scared. It scared textbook writers and producers because the idea was if you create materials that are going to spark this sort of thing, they're going to come to national attention. The very textbook that was cited within the state of Tennessee as the one that Scopes supposedly taught out of, actually, in its next edition, removed the word evolution from that section. Still taught basically the same context, but sort of dodged around the term. And for a little while, for the next few decades in American education, even though understandings of biology were built on evolutionary assumptions, because that was just the state of biological science at the time, or I shouldn't say evolutionary assumptions, well-founded evolutionary ideas at this point, but those are the base model of biology. Textbooks still dodged the issue through wording. They would avoid using the term of evolution as much as possible until the 1950s, when there was a different moral panic, which was that the US was falling behind the Soviet Union in science education. And they rewrote a bunch of textbooks, and this issue, this fear in textbooks, suddenly disappeared. But yeah, between
there
the 1920s
does seem to be an
and
attention
1950s,
span issue that we can only solve one problem at a time, even if it unsolves, what you might have perceived to be a problem previously.
Right. So it was interestingly more or less the second Red Scare that ended this period of fear of teaching of evolution in schools that came out of this trial, which is interesting.
Well, and we know today that publishing textbooks is a tricky business, and it's a pretty political business, and it's we have at least 100 years worth of sort of legacy to that. I imagine there's been ebbs and flows. I think for the most part people are disinterested, but like I said, I think that think of the children component really elevates any issue. But I feel like I wonder how this trial would play today. And part of me thinks that it wouldn't. Part of me thinks that it's too small that it never seemed to have any national implications.
It's also worth pointing out that this law is considered unconstitutional now.
So it's settled law opposite.
Epperson versus Arkansas case basically said that these sorts of laws that prohibit the teaching of evolution do so for primarily religious reasons, almost inarguably, and therefore violate the establishment clause. So today, they are actually unconstitutional in the United States. And
that argument really does, what we saw in the trial really shows that this was very much a conversation about religion, which
was the entire trial. Remember, 9 minutes. 9 minutes.
9 minutes
for the jury to decide after 11 days of discussion, because the relevant facts of the case were not the primary discussion that was going on.
Makes me wonder how many days of discussion we could remove and still have roughly the same time of deliberation.
I think it could have been a couple hours. The difference was they had celebrities here. The celebrities were soapboxing for a media audience, and they knew it.
Yeah. And maybe that's the difference, that folks worked hard to make this the literal circus that it became.
They brought chimps.
I don't think the effort would be put in quite the same way. That this looks harder. I feel like we concoct what would you call it? We concoct scandals quite easily and quite cheaply today. This seemed like a lot of work.
Yeah, it was a lot of work. And it actually, to wrap around to the start of our plot here, it brought positive attention to Dayton. Reporters largely reported that they had good times there, that it was a pleasant town, that even though they had certain stereotypes about the South and Tennessee, they largely found a amicable, nice environment.
Except for that time where they had to go outside because the courthouse became too hot. I guess they didn't hold that against them.
Yeah, I guess not. They found the people friendly. They found the locals friendly. And Dayton received largely positive media buzz. So
Dayton was the real winner of the trial.
Our conspirators here were successful in their attempts to make their town notable.
And at the end, they're like, but who was the true mastermind? And it's the Dayton Chamber of Commerce guy just wringing his hands and laughing maniacally in his office. All according to plan.
They didn't care about this. This was all just an issue that they blew to national attention for local businesses.
Well, that's the lesson here. I think that's the takeaway. If you belong to, if your tourism isn't great, if you need more people in your shopping districts, concoct some sort of court case around education and what we teach kids, and you too can become the next Dayton. So, if that's what you want to go for, do you feel like we missed anything, Jacob? I feel like we've. I feel roundly educated. Do you have any final notes or other references you want to toss to us at the end here?
It looks like a busybody in the audience is raising a hand.
Oh my goodness. Let's get them on stage once I figure out how to do that again. Hey.
Hi.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I actually did have a question. I didn't just raise my hand for the sake of it. But you guys have spoken about the parallels between the political situation of the 1920s that led to the trial and the political situation of today. But what I wanted to know is what direct impact did the trial have on the broader political framework, and how much of that is carried over into the modern day?
Well, it depends on if you think it killed Brian. No, basically.
I don't think it helped substitute teachers on any level. Substitute teachers are not seen as moral paragons of teaching in the United States, nor are they paid particularly well, at least where I live.
Well, as a substitute teacher, this is unfortunate, but I would say that the biggest thing here regarding politics is actually the relationship of religion to politics. the fundamentalist movement, the fundamentalist modernist controversy, would have a split in the decades afterwards, and that was between fundamentalists and neo-evangelicals. Neo-evangelicals would be people like what's his name? Why am I forgetting his name? The radio guy.
I probably never knew his name, so I should feel worse about that.
Oh, you definitely do. He's like the biggest. I should not forget this. Billy Graham. Billy Graham was one of the major figures in like the Cold War era afterwards in the neo-evangelical split. And this was partly in reaction to this process that the Scopes trial helped sort of kick off, which was that a lot of people in the fundamentalist movement were sort of worried about the direction it was taking. It was like, should we really be at conflict with society at large when we're actually living in the society, right? And things like this sort of showcased how there was, this discomfort that existed. And so the neo-evangelical split that we now call the evangelical movement today, although fundamentalism has interestingly largely merged back into that since, basically were people who were like, hey, we believe in biblical literalism and stuff, but maybe separating ourselves from society and like antagonizing it is not actually a good thing. And so you can see the Scopes trial sort of being this media wake-up call that took several decades to actually come to fruition, where people, even on the side that essentially won in the short term, the fundamentalist side, in the public perception, was, people were uncomfortable with the way things were looking. They didn't want to be on the opposite side of where everyone else was hanging out. They wanted to just be members of society.
We really do live in a society.
Yeah.
I think that, the dividing line then was probably even easier to draw, because I think people in the 1920s, many people were still identifying very strongly with their religious tradition, whereas we tend to think of things as being post-denominational sometimes in the United States now. But that, that those narratives aren't entirely true.
Right.
But
I mean, even here, people were organizing across various divisions. Like, this was a largely Protestant debate, but
right.
It was still sort of pan-Protestant in nature.
Yeah, well, politics makes strange bedfellows, and I think when you have religion in politics, then it goes double. But I wonder, and I feel like I studied American history, so I should know this, but I don't know to what extent this sort of helped create this. Yes, your theology should be political, or your politics will be theological in some way. I wonder if it normalized something that used to be, like I said earlier, and sort of in two separate corners where their interactions were limited as possible.
Right. I think really the trial though shows that existed beforehand as well, because like figures like Brian, who was very much after the end of his political career. Like, this was him.
It was there to be seized upon.
He was already had the perspective that he was, in politics on the basis of his beliefs and working for his beliefs. His sort of progressive stances were because he believed in Christian goodwill towards other people, at least in the framing he would have put it. So, the idea that politics and religion go hand in hand is something as old and older than U.S. politics. So I think that really the modern form of the debate came into its form around this time that we're talking about, but really it's something that's been there a long time.
Well, I hope that on, Dank Christian Memes, whether it's on our Discord or on the Reddit itself or wherever, that we can elevate the conversation a little bit more, a little above these, whether it was the sort of drama of 100 years ago or some of the drama we see between religious and non-religious folks on Reddit today. A nuanced view and a more friendly conversation often has better outcome. But that's not what everyone comes to the internet for. So that's the reality of it. But so I'm just philosophizing now. Were there any other questions or anything else to wrap up before I do our show notes thing? Jacob, do you want to remind us about your other podcasts so people can get more of your in-depth historical reporting?
So we have I'm part of a little history nerds network, we call it, that it's made up of 3 different podcasts that I am on, all 3 of them. So make sure to check out Potting Through Time, where we do a history variety show. History Nerds Conversation Parlour, where we talk with sort of notable figures within the online history sphere. And then especially for fans of this podcast, Potting Through Religion, where we talk about religious history. Andrew, who often appears on this show as a guest, is on PTR as well. So come check us out.
And if you send me those links, I can make sure they find their way into our description so folks can enjoy all your podcasting goodness, because we are but one of the many podcasts you work on. So thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for taking the suggestion I had to have this topic, because I just really wanted to talk about it.
No, it's a really good one. And like I said, we see hot debate on Reddit sometimes, and that's just going to happen. But we also see people cool over the years and then come to a place like Dank Christian Memes where we can joke and have fun and ask some of these weird questions that came up in the trial but didn't necessarily have any significance. So I think, once we all, mellow out a little bit, maybe introduce a little nuance, that these same topics can actually be fun and funny, and we do that sometimes here. So, Anyway, this has been the Dank Christian Memes podcast. If you're interested in joining our live recordings, we do them on Discord, and you can find a link to our Discord in our description here. Our music is provided by Olive Tiger. Thank you again for listening, and until next time, may the memes bless you and keep you.
Wait to the waves of the stereo. Wait to the waves of the stereo. This is my sanctuary, and we are the choir. This is my sanctuary.